This week on Jerusalem Dateline, we take an in-depth look at the history of the modern state of Israel through the eyes of its founders.
CBN's new documentary, The Hope, explores how courageous leaders birthed a nation and fulfilled biblical prophecy along the way.
Welcome to this special edition of Jerusalem Dateline. I'm Chris Mitchell.
And I'm Julie Stahl.
In today's edition, we look at the first part of CBN's documentary, The Hope. In the year 70 AD, the Romans conquered Jerusalem, and the Jewish people were scattered throughout the world. But even in exile, they celebrated Passover each year with a prayer of hope, next year in Jerusalem.
After more than 1,800 years, the dream of a Jewish homeland was stronger than ever, and in the late 19th century, a young writer from Vienna brought that dream to the attention of the world. We begin this special with the story of Theodor Herzl, the unlikely father of modern Zionism.
In 1893, a Viennese journalist wrote, "When I think of my son's future, I ask myself whether I have the right to make life so difficult for him as it has become for me. That is why we must baptize Jewish children, while they can still feel nothing, either for it or against it. We Jews must submerge in the people."
In nomine Patris, et Filii, et Spiritus Sancti.
It's not something you'd expect to hear from the man known as the father of Zionism. But those words were written by Theodor Herzl, who spent his life trying to solve what he called the Jewish question. Herzl was born in Budapest in 1860. At the time, the city was known as Judapest because of its large Jewish population. As a boy, he attended a Christian high school that was open to Jews. And on his 13th birthday, his parents held a confirmation ceremony instead of a bar mitzvah.
Theodor Herzl was an assimilated Jew who came from an assimilated family. He was not educated in the Jewish sphere at all. He was very, very far from Judaism.
His family later moved to Vienna, where Herzl earned a law degree. But his real passion was writing, so he divided his time between writing plays, working as a reporter, and looking for a way to end anti-Semitism.
Theodor Herzl is the one who sort of pulls it together, but there are many. There are Christian ministers, there are rabbis, there are presidents, there are all kinds of people who are saying, wait a minute, we've got this problem.
At one point, Herzl even proposed a mass baptism of Jewish babies in Vienna's largest cathedral. He believed that if Jews adopted Christian culture, they would finally be accepted by European society. But Theodor Herzl was about to get an assignment that would change his mind.
It was as a journalist for the top newspaper in Vienna that he was sent to Paris to write about the wonderful French experience. Herzl, who was a bon vivant, and was living in Paris and enjoying himself and going to the theater 3 times a week, and all of a sudden, he saw the ugly face of anti-Semitism.
Herzl was assigned to cover the famous Dreyfus Affair, in which a French Jewish captain was falsely convicted of spying for the Germans. Herzl watched as Alfred Dreyfus was stripped of his medals and publicly degraded at the military school in Paris. Crowds filled the streets, shouting death to the Jews.
People are inflamed, and they're shouting, not down with Dreyfus, not down with the individual, they shout down with the Jews. And Theodor Herzl has his aha moment.
Herzl realized that the only solution to anti-Semitism was for the Jews to have their own state.
Wonderful idea. How do you go about doing it? This is where the writer of plays came in, you know. He was going to set the stage.
Herzl shut himself in his apartment and wrote his ideas down for 5 straight days. When a friend of his visited, he was alarmed by Herzl's disheveled appearance and wild ideas. He suggested they get some fresh air. And as they walked, he told Herzl to get some medical help before someone hauled him off to a madhouse. Herzl paid no attention, and the following year, he published his most famous work, The Jewish State.
Theodor Herzl, in his book, The Jewish State, dreams. And he talks about this new nation state being a beacon to humanity. He talks about it being a model democracy.
Not everyone was thrilled with Herzl's ideas. Religious Jews thought it was blasphemy to reestablish the nation of Israel without the Messiah. Nevertheless, Herzl worked tirelessly to realize his vision. He even tried to buy the land of Palestine.
He tried to create a situation where he will be introduced to the Sultan of Turkey and he will buy the land of Israel from him. Boy, that's going to cost a lot of money. How is he going to pay for it? Well, he had the dream. He had an idea. He says, I'm going to take half of the riches of all the rich Jews. Well, of course, there was absolutely no chance that any of these people would do that. They did not want to see Zionism succeed, in fact. But he was convinced that that's the way to do it.
When we come back, for the first time in almost 2,000 years, Jewish delegates from 17 countries gather for the first World Zionist Congress.
Welcome back. In his relentless effort to gather his people back to Zion, Herzl forms an alliance with the first known Christian to support their cause for Zion.
And as he wins the support of this Christian man, Herzl starts observing more Jewish traditions, no longer feeling the need to blend in with Christian Europe.
In 1897, Herzl gathered Jewish delegates from around the world for the first World Zionist Congress. For this historic meeting, he chose the city of Basel in Switzerland.
By the way, do you know why it was in Basel? It was supposed to be in Munich. And in Munich there were Jews who called themselves Germans of the faith of Moses. And they said to him, we don't want this Jewish riffraff from all over the world coming to Munich.
In August, more than 200 delegates from 17 countries arrived in Basel. It was the first representative Jewish assembly in nearly 2,000 years, and the atmosphere was electric. Behind the podium hung a white flag with 2 blue stripes and a Star of David, a version of the design that would be adopted by the State of Israel 50 years later. Among the delegates was a man Herzl introduced as the first Christian Zionist. The Reverend William Heckler was the British embassy chaplain in Vienna. He was deeply interested in the return of the Jews to Israel, so he helped Herzl make some important political connections, and the two became lifelong friends. As Herzl walked to the podium, people cheered and stomped their feet. He opened the Congress by announcing, "We are here to lay the foundation stone of the house which is to shelter the Jewish nation." The applause was deafening. One English delegate described the excitement of the crowd. "By the rivers of Babylon, we sat down and wept as we remembered Zion. By the rivers of Basel, we sat down and resolved to weep no more."
The beautiful thing about Theodor Herzl and the beautiful thing about Zionism is that it doesn't just stop with the negative. There is anti-Semitism, and there is negativity, and there's a certain rejection on the part of Europe. But what they also do is, I call it the jujitsu move, where you take the negative and you turn it into something positive.
A few days later, Herzl made a bold statement in his diary.
At Basel, I founded the Jewish state. If I say this out loud today, I would be answered by universal laughter. Perhaps in 5 years, and certainly in 50. Everyone will know it.
Herzl's statement turned out to be prophetic. 50 years later, the United Nations approved a plan to divide Palestine into Jewish and Arab states. And 9 months later, the State of Israel was born. After the Congress, Herzl, who had never been religious, started observing some Jewish traditions. That winter, instead of having a Christmas tree, the Herzl family celebrated their first Hanukkah.
Coming up, as Herzl rallies support, a massacre in Russia sets off the first negotiations to get Zion back.
Welcome back to Jerusalem Dateline. While in France, Theodor Herzl got a glimpse of how far anti-Semitism would go when he witnessed crowds shouting, "Down with the Jews."
Only a few years later, he saw those words fulfilled when Russian Orthodox men shouted almost the same words before killing dozens of Jews. But as Gordon Robertson explains, that tragedy is what ignited the hope of going home to Zion.
Despite growing health problems, Herzl traveled the globe, trying to get backers for the new state. He went first to Constantinople, then on to Jerusalem in hopes of asking the Ottoman Sultan for land. Then in the spring of 1903, the need for a Jewish state became more urgent than ever, as the world turned its focus on a small town in Russia. On Easter Sunday, a group of Russian Orthodox men entered the Jewish quarter of the village of Kishinev. Led by their priest, they shouted, "Death to the Jews." The same cry Herzl had heard in Paris during the Dreyfus Affair almost 10 years earlier. Eyewitnesses described the bloody massacre that followed. Wives, along with their husbands, were shot down. A synagogue worker was killed protecting the Torah with his body. Children had their brains dashed out against the walls. And even babes were snatched from the arms of pleading mothers and hurled through windows. At sunset, the streets were piled with corpses. After 3 days, more than 40 Jews were killed, 92 were injured, and more than 700 homes were looted and destroyed. Four months later, the Jewish Congress convened under the shadow of the massacre, but that was just the beginning. Herzl had good news and bad news for the crowd. The good news was that Great Britain wanted to help the Jewish people. The bad news was how they wanted to help. After the Kishinev pogrom, Herzl had an emergency meeting with British politicians. He asked them for land in Cyprus or the Sinai Peninsula, both of which were under British control. The plan was to rescue the Jews from Russia and still be close to Palestine. The British refused and offered them land in British East Africa, now Uganda. With no other choice, Herzl accepted the offer, and the British drew up a plan for a colony they called New Palestine. In 1903, Herzl presented the idea to the Zionist Congress with disastrous results.
Zionism refers to Zion, and the plan was eventually to have Zion as the homeland. Nobody was giving this up. But for now, we're going to get ourselves a place to hide.
It was the delegates from Russia, whom Herzl was trying to protect, who took the news the hardest. They stormed out of the concert hall in protest. Among them was a young man who would become the first president of the new state of Israel, Chaim Weizmann.
The Zionists from Russia hated the idea. So they basically mounted a revolution against him and broke his heart, and he had been dealt such a tremendous shock that everybody doesn't take his word for the gospel truth.
Herzl closed the Sixth Zionist Congress by raising his right hand and reciting a verse from the Psalms. If I forget thee, O Jerusalem, may my right hand forget its skill. These were the last words he would ever speak at the podium in Basel. Only his close friends and family knew that he was suffering from heart failure. And over the next year, his health declined rapidly. He told his old friend, Reverend Heckler, "Greet Palestine for me. I gave my heart's blood for my people." He died the next day. And at his funeral in Vienna, more than 6,000 people gathered to honor the man they had called King of the Jews. In 1949, the new government of Israel honored Herzl's dying request. They brought his remains from Vienna and reburied them here, on a hill overlooking Jerusalem. During his lifetime, Herzl was called everything from a hero to a dreamer to a heretic. But his influence on the Jewish people is undeniable. In the last decade of his life, he gave them something they hadn't had in nearly 2,000 years, the hope of going home.
He was an amazing man. He deserves a lot of credit. He had a dream, and it was a good dream. But you know, there's a distance between dreaming and between bringing something to fruition. It took pioneers, it took men of action, men of work. Herzl was, in the words of that wonderful song, the wind beneath their wings.
Up next, we fast forward to modern-day Israel, where Herzl's dreams continue to flourish. And we introduce you to a Christian man whose Jewish grandmother surprised him with the task to continue blessing her people. Welcome back to Jerusalem Dateline. You've been watching the first part of CBN's documentary, The Hope, which tells the story of the founding of the modern state of Israel. All throughout history, we've seen and continue to witness how God blesses those who bless His people.
Theodor Herzl pulled from the wealth of Jews and non-Jews around the world to build and bless Israel. And that vision lives on more than 100 years later through both Jews and non-Jews. And it's with one of those stories that we want to conclude the show today. Here's the adventure of a young seminary student in the U.S. who had to figure out what to do with millions of dollars he unexpectedly inherited when his Jewish grandmother passed away.
Walter Panzier never played wheelchair basketball until he visited this rehab center for wounded Israeli soldiers.
Oh, that was incredibly difficult. They made it look so easy.
Panzier and 3 other trustees oversee one of the largest foundations in the world, the Leona Helmsley Charitable Trust. They donate millions each year to worthy projects around the world, like the Israel Rehab Center. Helmsley built a hotel and real estate empire estimated at $6 billion. She owned the Empire State Building and gained a reputation, to put it mildly, as a difficult boss. When she named her grandson as a trustee, it was something he never expected.
This is amazing. As a Christian, if you would have asked me 10 years ago, would I be standing here in Israel? I'd say absolutely not. As I went through my pastoral studies, if I was asked if I was going to be in Israel helping Israelis, helping the poor across Africa with our other projects, and helping people in the United States, I would never believe it in a million years. This is truly a blessing to be here.
They support a number of projects in Israel, including one of the world's leading brain research centers. Fellow trustee Sandy Frankel feels it's always timely to bless Israel.
Every time is an important time, and Whenever now is the most important time. Tomorrow will be the most important time, even more important than today. When you think about Israel, a flower flourishing in a tsunami of war and hatred and upheaval in this part of the world, and still it manages to flourish, it's a miracle.
Absolutely. Israel is the light to the nations, and the world, I feel, doesn't understand that. There's so much where they're caught up on the conflicts that's going on in Israel. And there's so much more to Israel than just the conflicts. There's wonderful scientific research being done here. There's wonderful humanitarian aid being done here. That's not getting reported by mainstream press.
During their visit, a terror attack took place in Tel Aviv, while a border incident flared along the northern border with Lebanon. Yet life goes on.
And we hear the same thing over and over again, how strong the Israeli will is here, how strong the people are, even at horrible times with rockets coming in and at a brink of war. People are at peace here. People go on with their daily lives.
When you help Israel, you help the world. That's what people don't realize. Israelis aren't an inward people who are trying only to help themselves. What they do benefits the world.
The story of Israel is an amazing story of hope, boldness, and perseverance in the face of adversities, and the fulfillment of biblical prophecy.
You can watch the entire documentary, The Hope, The Rebirth of Israel, by getting a copy for just $10. To order your DVD or Blu-ray, just call the number on your screen or log on to cbn.com/Israel the Hope.
That's all for this special edition of Jerusalem Dateline, The Hope. Thanks for joining us.
Remember, you can follow us on Facebook and Twitter. We'll see you next time on Jerusalem Dateline.